Spirit has raised the shape in which it is present to its own consciousness into the form of consciousness itself, and it produces such a shape for itself. The artificer has given up the synthetic effort to blend the heterogeneous forms of thought and natural objects. Now that the shape has gained the form of self-conscious activity, he has become a spiritual worker. This short paragraph, number 699, is a very important transition point in a number of ways. There's actually a good bit going on within this paragraph itself that we'll talk about in just a moment. But we can also say that in starting this paragraph, we have now entered into the penultimate subsection of the penultimate portion of the work, that is religion, which is going to be succeeded by the very short absolute knowing, which will bring the entire phenomenology to a close. The history of the development and self-understanding of consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, spirit will be brought to a close in absolute knowing, and religion is, you might say, the royal road to get there. And this section is sandwiched in between natural religion, which we've just traversed, and then the religion that Hegel thinks is the sort of the most developed and interesting one, that is revealed religion, which we're going to be turning to Judaism and Christianity, and specifically to Protestant Christianity, and then what you might call it post-Protestant Christianity that Hegel is envisioning, which will then take us into absolute knowing. But in between, we have this, what Miller is translating as religion in the form of art, die Kunstreligion, right? Which you could also just translate as the art religion, or religion as art, which some of the other translators have chosen for this section. And you might say, well, what's the connection between religion and art? Okay, that's something that we have to explore throughout this section, but we can give a couple highlights. Who's Hegel talking about in this section? It's really going to be the Greeks, and this is kind of, you could say, typical not just of Hegel but also of European philosophy in general, particularly in the 19th century. There's this notion that the Greeks, and then by extension the Romans, are the highest level of philosophical development, and in some cases other types of spiritual development. But then Judaism and Christianity come on the scene and add something new. So we've got this long-standing conflict between Athens and Jerusalem, coming from the Tertullian quip. What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? And the answer, of course, is even just in the realm of ideas, an awful lot. But in the realm of real history, way more. So Hegel is going to be focusing primarily on the Greek city-states and Greek civilization as producing something new. And he's not, as I pointed out, he's not unusual or let alone unique in doing so. This is a very common thing among Europeans in the 19th century, and Hegel's kind of a leader in that, but he's far from the only person saying this sort of stuff. I mean, this is a bit of a side note, but it goes down all the way to the 20th century when you see somebody like Martin Heidegger saying that only Greek and German are truly philosophical languages, that Latin, French, English, we could also say Spanish, Italian, let alone any non-Indo-European languages, aren't adequate, to convey this. It's typical of this. So when we're approaching this, we can relativize it, I think, to a certain extent, and say, what are we supposed to get out of this? What is Hegel getting at here? Because obviously the story that he's telling is at a pretty high level of generality. So that's a little bit of background stuff. Let's actually jump into the paragraph and look at what he has to say now. So there's a very interesting interplay here in this paragraph between two terms that have come up a lot in the religion section. one of these, actually both of these have been around the entire time in the phenomenology, but one of these is Gestalt, shape, right? And so Gestalt is Bewusstsein, shape of consciousness. This is indeed what the entirety of this work has been developing. A shape of consciousness is a certain point in the dialectic where somebody is understanding themselves, the absolute, others, the world, through some sort of ways in which things are formulated. Generally, how they're represented, and how their own agency or what they suffer is connected with that, right? So we've seen a lot of different shapes of consciousness. We're seeing some now. Religion is also a recounting, the section religion, a recounting of different shapes of consciousness. Hegel has told us at the beginning of the section. And then we have this other term, form, right? And form is the same in both English and German. So we've got shapes, we've got forms. It's often tempting to translate Gestalt by form, but we don't want to do that. We want to say shape in this case. And the shape and the shaping is going to be something that we can see, something tangible. Or a little bit later, perhaps, in this particular subsection, it'll be something that we can read or hear, the epic poetry, for example. So we want to keep this in mind. We also want to keep in mind that a transition point was reached in the end of the natural religion section, where we're moving from the Werkmeister, the artificer, into somebody who is a genuine artist, a Künstler, somebody who is producing works of art, which could be works of literature, also works of music as well. There's something new that's happening here. So let's pick it up. And he's talking in rather abstract terms at the beginning. He says, spirit has raised the shape in which it is present to its own consciousness into the form of consciousness itself, and it produces such a shape for itself. So what are we talking about there? Well, spirit is, when he says spirit has done this, spirit is acting, religion is a way in which spirit, through human beings, becomes conscious of itself. And we've seen this before, in the unhappy consciousness, when there was this alienation of projecting the divine way out there, and I'm the miserable worm over here, trying to relate myself to it unsuccessfully. In the religion of art, there's a much stronger possibility of identification. As a matter of fact, the gods they don't become human as such, but they become much more human-like. And there's a sort of a double side to this. One is we can relate to them a little bit more, thinking about Hephaestus and the activity of working in the forge and finding out that your spouse is being unfaithful to you, and being a good mama's boy who gets hurt because of his dad throwing him out of the heavens and stuff like that, or being Ares, or being Athena, or any of these other gods that we might relate ourselves to. There's also the fact that human beings, for Hegel, take themselves out of the natural existence. And we do try to manipulate it, to assimilate it, to change it. But there's a difference between nature and culture that is at the heart of what it means to be a human being. It's not something that's fully resolved. And those gods are similarly like that. So, spirit is consciousness, right? Spirit has raised the shape in which it is present to its own consciousness. What is the shape in which it's present to its own consciousness? Well, there's a double-sidedness to this. There's the shape as in the worker or worshiper, sometimes the same person, sometimes just members of the same community, right? Those are a shape of consciousness. And then there's the shape, the thing that's been worked upon by the master, the artificer, through the Arbeiten, the working of that person. And so there's the work as it is produced, we could say. And that might be a temple. That might be, in the case of other things in this section, a poem, an ode to the gods. It might be an epic. It might be a tragedy. It might be a statue. It might be some sort of offering. So all of these are possibilities for the way in which spirit is becoming aware of itself. What this means is that if we think about religion in very materialistic terms, we're actually missing out on what religion meant and does in fact mean for many people, that it's a way in which we could say the divine, through the human, is becoming aware of itself. So he goes on and he says, we've got spirit is present to itself in the form of consciousness through this shape, this gestalt. And then he goes on and says the artificer, the Werkmeister, has given up, and here's an interesting thing, a synthetic effort, and that's the word, synthesische, right? To blend the heterogeneous forms of thought and natural objects. What was that about? Well, all the things that were happening in the previous section, trying to take natural objects and turn them into something that could be an adequate bearer of the divine and of consciousness, being conscious of itself. So he says, now that the shape has gained the form of self-conscious activity, this is very important, the shape has gained a form of self-conscious activity. What is self-conscious activity? Is it activity where you're like, oh, I better not screw this up, everybody's watching me? No, you're aware of what you're doing, of the contribution that you're making, and of the ends that you have in mind, and of perhaps the audience or the God that you're trying to symbolize in some way. All of that could be part of self-conscious activity. We should also remember that self-consciousness is self-consciousness for another self-consciousness. So implicit in this is already that this is for a community, not just for the isolated artist by themselves engaging in self-conscious activity. And he goes on and he concludes this by saying he has become a spiritual worker, Geistige, right? Somebody who can actually, we might say, take a greater agency in shaping the way in which spirit understands itself. If we ask which is the actual spirit which has the consciousness of its absolute essence in the religion of art, we find that it is the ethical or the true spirit. This is not merely the universal substance of all individuals. On the contrary, since this substance has for actual consciousness the shape of consciousness and it is individualized, it follows that the substance is known by the individuals as their own essence and their own work. It is for them neither the divine essential light in whose unity the being for self or self-consciousness is contained only negatively, only transitorily, and in which it beholds the Lord and Master of its actual world, nor is it the restless destruction of hostile peoples, nor their subjection to a caste system which gives the semblance of organization of a completed whole, but in which the universal freedom of the individuals is lacking. On the contrary, this spirit is the free nation in which hallowed custom constitutes the substance of all, whose actuality and existence each and everyone knows to be his own will and deed. Paragraph 700 of the Phenomenology of Spirit is now making a little bit more clear what we have in mind in terms of this religion of art, the religion of the artistic production, bringing the gods, you might say, or the divine a bit closer to humanity. And Hegel very clearly has the Greeks in mind, as reading ahead will tell you, but you can also see this here in this section in the way that he's handling things. And I do have to remark that what's happening here is at a very high level of abstraction. If you're looking at actual, Greek city-states in the way that, say, Aristotle and Theophrastus did. These great ancient philosophers who thought that you needed to go to, take a look at the way things are actually dealt with, lived, understood in each of these societies that are held together by this essence of being part of Greece, or a Hellenic mentality. There's a vast diversity between the different states. And, there's also, he's going to talk about a caste system, and that this isn't a caste system, but that everybody is able to participate in it. Well, that we know that wasn't the case, because ancient Greece, like pretty much every other developed society, had a lot of poor people and had slaves and had resident aliens, and there's a lot more going on there. But let's put that aside for the moment and see what he has to say. So this is a very startling thing to begin with. He says, if we ask, what is the actual spirit, the wirkliche Geist, right, the actual or real spirit, which has the consciousness of its absolute essence in the religion of art, right? So the spirit that is getting to know itself through this artistic production and contemplation, enjoyment, all of those sorts of things. What does Hegel tell us? We find it is, here he has two different predicates. The ethical, sittliche, or true, wahre, spirit. What does that mean to be? So the true spirit, truth in Hegel is kind of a complicated thing. He doesn't operate with anything remotely like a correspondence theory of truth. As a matter of fact, he's often held up as somebody who, although he doesn't endorse this explicitly, has what we call a coherence theory of truth, where you have to understand things within the totality. True spirit is going to be spirit that is expressing itself to the greatest extent, that has developed itself, that it's at the end of the process, or at least here in this case, in the middle of the process, getting us through this section and then to the absolute religion, that of revelation, which is going to, sublate what we've got going on here in a natural religion and then move into absolute knowing. But what is he talking about in terms of the ethical spirit? Why return to the ethical, the sittliche, especially after the last section of spirit was all about morality? We know that for Hegel, the ethical and the moral are not precisely the same thing. By the way, a little bit of a side note here. People who have read Introduction to Ethics textbooks, or go onto websites or stuff like that, they often say, "Oh, well, I know that there's a difference between the ethical and the moral," and they're not clear about the fact that yes, there are distinctions that people make between these two. They're not always the same. Some people are like, well, the moral is about codes and customs, and ethics is the science of studying it. For Hegel, it's actually the opposite. What Hegel means by the sittliche, the ethical, customs fall under that. It's the thing where, he talks about the ethical substance of a community. Morality is more individuated, more rationalized, more uprooted from this, basic sort of ethics that communities have. So whatever you've read about ethics and morality, put that on the side when you're coming to Hegel, because you might actually have the wrong idea about how these are related. So in Hegel's phenomenology, we encountered the ethical already at a number of different places. I mean, particularly in the spirit section, we began with the ethical order, right? That was in ancient Greece as well. And we talked about the Antigone and all sorts of other cool stuff. And then that led us into, the noble and base consciousness and state power and all of these other things that eventually get us to the Enlightenment and, struggle between, faith and skepticism. And eventually we get to the French Revolution and we can think about all those things. There was also stuff going on in the reason section, wasn't there? We had all these attempts for the individual to orient him or herself in relation to the ethical substance, die Sache selbst. So, the law of the heart and frenzy of self-conceit, reason giving laws to itself, all those things were ways in which spirit, through individual human beings and their cultural matrices and productions, was trying to grasp this universal substance of, ethics within a community. We can even say that there were similar issues coming up in the morality section. So this is kind of an interesting thing to say. I do want to say one other thing about this. You might say religion and ethics, and again, this would be a product of having read too many intro to ethics textbooks or philosophy of religion textbooks, or looking at too many superficial websites. Religion and ethics, two different things. You can't get one out of the other. Or religious ethics, those aren't real ethics. Those are coming down from on high. You got to put yourself in Hegel's time. There was this guy, Immanuel Kant, before Hegel, right? And Kant has a book called Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone. And what are you going to find if you actually read that? It's mostly about ethics, right? All of these great religious conceptions were being transformed into ethical conceptions, and some people were like, well, let's strip away all the supernatural aspects of religion, just hold on to the ethical stuff, which is coming through these, ancient religious ideas that now can be purified by reason. So there is a very strong intrinsic connection going back both ways between ethics and religion. And for the ancient Greeks, this was indeed the case for many of them. A lot of the ethical quandaries are worked out by having the gods chew on them a bit in dialogue, or other ways like that. So you've got to be a little bit careful in thinking about that. Now let's jump to the text. So he says, this is not merely, what is that? The ethical or true spirit, the universal substance of all individuals. So it is indeed the universal substance of all individuals, right? It's not merely that. It's not just that. So don't say, well, it's not that at all. It is that, and that's part of what gives us our grounding. So he goes on and he says, on the contrary, since this substance has for actual consciousness the shape, the gestalt of consciousness, and now here Hegel says something really interesting, and is individualized. Hegel uses the term Individuation, right? And this is taken right out of the Latin, and is there as kind of like a loan word. It's not Einzel, it's not rooted in Einzelheit or the Einzelnen, individuality that way. It's this other term that he's using to denote this. So this, the shape of consciousness, the Gestalt, is being individualized in who? Well, at the very least, in the producer, in the artist, the Künstler, the person who is producing the work of art. But also we could say in the objects of the works of art, the various deities, gods, demigods that are all depicted in monsters, right? And the worshiper, the consumer, the user of this is also being individualized as well. What this yields us, he says, the substance, the ethical substance, the universal ethical substance of all, of our community, is known by the individuals. Now here's where he says, as their own essence and their own work. Not as the essence and the work of, the we, all of us together, but he says, ihr eigenes, their own as individuals. So my relation to the gods through using, say, a liturgical hymn to Apollo, when we actually have quite a few of these left, we know about these through antiquity, or through reading Homer, or watching, a recitation of Homer, or whatever it's going to be, it is my own. It is not simply me participating in, well, everybody else is doing this, and this is what mom and dad did, and their mom and dad did, and the city does. It's becoming individuated. So we realize that this substance is known as their own essence, their own Wesenheit, and their own work, their own production. Here Hegel then says, it's not this, it's this instead. So let's go through these. What is it not? Each of these corresponds to either previous discussions in the religion section or things that will get discussed in Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of religion. So the first one, divine essential light, right? It is not the divine essential light in whose unity the being for self of self-consciousness is contained only negatively, only transitorily, in which it beholds the Lord and Master of the actual world. God is not just the Lord and Master writ large, whether it be the Master of the Master-Slave dialectic or the Lord and Master who shows up at many other points in the work as well, in the unhappy consciousness, in the reason section, in the spirit section, over and over again. So it's not that, right? It's also not this restless destruction of hostile or hateful, hasrika, peoples, Völker, right? Other people, this domination of one tribe or nation by another, imposing its religion and its gods on it, associating into larger and larger complexes. That may be going on. This may be going on, but that's not what's happening here in the religion of art. He also talks about it not being a caste system, Kasten in Hegel's German. And so he definitely has something in mind like India, I think, in this case. He says it's not the subjection to a caste system which gives the semblance, the appearance of organization of a completed whole, but in which the universal freedom, Freiheit, of the individuals is lacking. So, what's wrong with a caste system? It looks an awful lot like a, one big happy family Hegelian organic state, but the people within it are not free. They can't move from one caste to another if they would wish to. They can't innovate. They can't do anything that would be, their own, you could say. In this new stage, we do have the individual able to think for themselves, to innovate. So he goes on and he says, this spirit, the actual spirit of the religion as a work of art, the ethical or true spirit, this spirit is the free nation, das freie Volk, right? As opposed to these other nations, in which, now here Miller's adding a word, hallowed custom, right? There's no hallowed, actually, like heiligen, or anything. Custom, though, is die Sitte. And this could be translated as custom, ethical norms, ethics itself, right? This is the substance of everybody. And he says, whose actuality and existence. Now, this is, going back to the previous paragraphs. Outside of this section, in previous sections, the actuality, Wirklichkeit, and the existence, Dasein, these are terms that kept coming up in the religion section. Those are, he says, each and every one knows this to be his own will and deed. So there is a kind of ownership, a kind of taking responsibility, but also being given the privilege of speaking for oneself involved in this. Now again, to close this out, how realistic a picture is this of Greek religion and of Greek culture in antiquity? It reminds me very much of Hegel's dictum in the lectures on the philosophy of history, where he criticizes the entirety of the East for, having realized that one man may be free, right? There's a lord and master, but everybody else is essentially under this despot. And then he says the Greeks realized that some could be free, right? But not everybody. And then through Christianity, and specifically, Protestant Christianity, human beings have realized that all men can be free, right? Or all human beings. Hegel's, I think it is gendered language in there, perhaps. So the Greeks, at this stage in the religion of art, are kind of where Hegel's presenting European Christian consciousness in the late Middle Ages as attaining. Let's put that aside for the moment. There is something that he thinks is really important going on here, and this individualization is central to it.